Okay, another video about the analytic approach to group therapy. I could talk about group therapy forever. I just love the processes that occur in group therapy. And the psychoanalytic approach is one of those processes that's absolutely fascinating when you see it unfold with clients who are really struggling with some deep-seated, mostly traumatic issues and neglect and, other kinds of things, even when they've been the ones that have acted out in criminal ways. Those are the guys that I work with. So in the psychoanalytic approach, there's the concept of anxiety. And I want you to really focus on what anxiety means in a psychoanalytic perspective. What are some specific ways that anxiety is revealed from the client standpoint? And what are some specific things that might produce an anxiety-provoking situation? The other thing to think about as far as a psychoanalytic approach is ego defense mechanisms. Defenses are used to protect our egos. Egos are fragile with people who have experienced trauma or, years and years of abuse or neglect and all these kinds of painful things. And so these defenses have been there to serve them well during those times. However, they're not necessarily needed anymore. And so in interpersonal dynamics, those defense mechanisms, they don't fit anymore, if that makes sense. And so it's adaptive again, and it was back in the time when they were in the situation that was dangerous. But if you're defending yourself in a situation that's not dangerous, it can come across as very pathological, and it can come across interpersonally like somewhat scary, and it can put people off. So when you think about the example I gave earlier of the group therapy situation where the gentleman who had experienced a lot of abuse and really a lot of neglect and bullying, he'd had a history of abuse as well, but in terms of his interpersonal relationships with peers, he'd been left out all the time and he'd been bullied severely his entire life. And so his ego was very fragile around relationships. And when people are inviting him over to do things, or when they're saying that they've made a phone call to him, his anxieties are on the rise, and he's feeling very protective of his ego. And his ego is very fragile. And so he came across as very angry towards them and would lash out at them. Well, you can imagine that that doesn't serve a relationship well at all. And so these defenses come up in ways. Now, when he was younger, that probably did serve him well. If he was being bullied and he got very angry and lashed out, it would be protective. And so, but it's no longer needed. And so that's, again, that unconscious stuff and that anxiety that drives this. And then those ego defenses come up when they're not needed. And they were adaptive at one point, but they're no longer adaptive. So that's just an example of that. So really focus on that in your chapter this week, those concepts. Resistance is something that can manifest itself in a lot of different ways depending on the client. And so I look at resistance I don't even really use the term resistance as much anymore, because I like to really look at what's underlying that resistance. And most of the time, it's a lot of fear. People may seem like they don't want to be in therapy, or they don't want to have to come to group, or they don't really need to do this, whatever it is they got to do. But it's really scary. And so that resistance, I think, is really based in fear, fear of the unknown, fear of being rejected, judged negatively, having to experience a lot of shame and anxieties and depressions, and all these things that they don't want to have to, that they feel will be intolerable. And so there can be that. So resistance can come up in group in a lot of ways. It can come up as defensiveness. It can come up as not showing up on time. It can come up as, I had a guy sitting in group one time. I can't remember if I've mentioned this in this class, but he joined group and he said to me before he joined, I'm not here to make any friends. I don't need friends. I don't want friends in this group. They're not my friends. And he sat out of the circle for probably, I want to say 6 months before he engaged. I mean, he would do the rote, like check in and what you have to do and that kind of thing, but mostly he sat out of the group. And I didn't force the issue. I let him come in when he was ready. He did. But that was his form of resistance. I'm going to protect myself from this group. I'm not going to be part of it. I'm not going to engage. Showing up late, like I said, can be another form. Not making the payments and racking up a huge debt. That's another thing that I sometimes see as resistance. Like you're kind of like, you're screw you to this therapy. I don't have to be here. I don't want to be here, so I'm not going to pay it. And so there's all kinds of things. So think about your own sources of resistance and reluctance. And explore this maybe with some peers or people in your life. Like when you think about things in your life that you might be resisting in passive ways or unconscious ways, and why might that be happening? And so you can think about that from the perspective of yourself, and then you'll see how that might translate into groups and into group therapy. From an analytic approach, the countertransference and transference issues are sort of instrumental and central issues in this approach. And so the transference and countertransference has to do with the relationship dynamic with the therapist and the client. And so there's the transference is sort of how the therapist is experiencing the client, and the countertransference is how the client is experiencing that therapist. And so, for example, I'm trying to think of an example in one of my sessions. Well, I was having a lot of this with a younger client of mine who had just had a child, and I was a new mom at the same time, and I felt very protective of the child. He was in trouble for sexual crimes and was really not going to be probably in a good space to be raising this child at this time. And him and his fiance had made the decision to put the baby up for adoption. Long story short, by the end of the pregnancy, they changed their mind. And I had a lot of countertransference coming up with respect to that, and my own feelings about that. And I had to really do a lot of consultation around that, because it was not my place to be worried so much about this little baby when the client was my client and this was the guy. Certainly you worry about children. I'm not suggesting that I wouldn't be protective of a child, but my issues were not based in the evidence of the reality of the situation. So when they made the decision, I had a lot of anger around that, and I had a lot of concerns for the child. But really, there's things that could be put in place for him to be a decent parent. And so I had to do some consultation and really kind of to be honest with myself about where were these feelings coming from. Well, I was going to be protective of, the child from a mother's perspective, because I'm a mother, and I had to look at that and realize that in order to be therapeutic with this guy and really be in his best interest, I needed to be considering and thinking about what it is he wanted in his role with his child, and then how can I support that role, and how can I help him get the right resources and make sure he has the right therapy and the right evaluations and parenting classes and supervision and chaperone and all that kind of stuff to make sure that whatever his wishes were at that time, we would be helpful in making that happen in a healthy way. So that's just an example of the transference and countertransference. The psychoanalytic approach is extremely exciting, I think, and there's a lot of really great concepts in this approach, and I have found it to be an essential thing to use in the group therapy format. And so I really encourage you to go through the chapter. It's probably some heavy stuff and some terms that maybe you haven't heard of and that you're not familiar with, and that's okay. Just take some time with it, go through the PowerPoints. If you have to reread things or find some other ways to look things up, or if you have questions for me, please feel free to ask. I'm always happy to talk about group therapy. It's my favorite way to do therapy. I just think it's so powerful. So sorry about the dog. Anyways. Read through things, make sure you understand the concept of free association, interpretation, dream analysis, and all those kinds of things. So that's all part of the analytic approach. All right, have a wonderful week 5, and we will be in touch.